crammed in there together, seeing each other's rushes. Except for Wilder, he's waiting for something really gruesome. Both women turned without thinking to look at Royal, but he took this in his stride. In an obscure way, it was his affection for Anne that had led him to display her to his neighbors below, his contribution to the new realm they would create together. By contrast, the Alsatian belonged to a more practical world. Already he knew that the dog might well prove useful, be more easily bartered than any woman in the future that lay ahead. He decided not to throw away the blood-stained jacket, glad to wear the dog's blood against his chest. He refused any offers to clean it from the wives of his fellow residents, who came in to comfort the two young women. The assaults on the Alsatian, and on Royal's wife, made his apartment a natural focus of his neighbors' decision to regain the initiative before they were trapped on the roof of the high-rise. To Pangborn, he explained that it was vital for them to enlist the support of the tenants living on the floors immediately below the 35th. To survive, we need allies as a buffer against any attacks from the lower levels, and also to give us access to more of the elevators. We're in danger of being cut off from the central mass of the building. Right, the gynecologist agreed, glad to see that Royal had at last woken up to the realities of their position. Once we've gained a foothold there, we can play these people off against those lower down. In short, balkanize the center section, and then begin the colonization of the entire building. In retrospect, it surprised Royal how easily they were able to implement these elementary schemes. At 9 o'clock, before the evening's parties began, Royal began to enlist the support of the residents below the 35th floor swimming pool. Expertly, Pangborn played on their grievances. These people shared many of the problems of the top-floor tenants. Their cars had also been damaged, and they had the same struggles with the declining water supply and air conditioning. In a calculated gesture, Royal and Pangborn offered them the use of the top-floor elevators. To reach their apartments, they would no longer have to enter the main lobby and run the gauntlet of 30 intervening floors. They would now wait for a top-level tenant to appear, enter the private lobby with them, and ride straight to the 35th floor without harassment, and then walk a few steps down to their apartments. The offer was accepted, Royal and Pangborn deliberately asking for no concessions in return. The deputation returned to the 40th floor, the members dispersing to their apartments to prepare for the evening's festivities. During the previous hour, a few trivial incidents had occurred. The middle-aged wife of a 28th-floor account executive had been knocked unconscious into a half-empty swimming pool, and a radiologist from the 7th floor had been beaten up among the dryers in the hairdressing salon. But, in general, everything within the high-rise was normal. As the night progressed, the sounds of continuous revelry filled the building. Beginning with the lower floors, the party spread upwards through the apartment block, investing it in an armor of light and festivity. Standing on his balcony, Royal listened to the ascending music and laughter as he waited for the two young women to dress. Far below him, a car drove along the access road to the nearby high-rise, its 3 occupants looking up at the hundreds of crowded balconies. Anyone seeing this ship of lights would take for granted that the 2,000 people on board lived together in a state of corporate euphoria. Invigorated by this tonic atmosphere, Anne and Jane Sheridan had made a rapid recovery. Anne no longer referred to their leaving the high-rise, and seemed to have forgotten that she had ever made the decision to go. The rough and tumble in the junior school had given her that previously missing sense of solidarity with the other tenants of the high-rise. In the future, violence would clearly become a valuable form of social cement. As Royal escorted her to the first party of the evening, given by a newspaper columnist on the 37th floor, she and Jane strolled arm in arm, buoyed up by reports of further confrontations, and by the news that 2 more floors, the 6th and the 14th, were now in darkness. Pangborn congratulated Royal on this, almost as if he believed that Royal was responsible. No one, even on the top floors, seemed aware of the contrast between the well-groomed revelers and the dilapidated state of the building. Along corridors strewn with uncollected garbage, past blocked disposal chutes and vandalized elevators, moved men in well-tailored dinner jackets. Elegant women lifted long skirts to step over the debris of broken bottles. The sense of expensive aftershave lotions mingled with the aroma of kitchen wastes. These bizarre contrasts pleased Royal, marking the extent to which these civilized and self-possessed professional men and women were moving away from any notion of rational behavior. He thought of his own confrontation with Wilder, which summed up all the forces in collision within the high-rise. Wilder had obviously begun his ascent of the building again, and had climbed as far as the 15th floor. By rights, the high-rise should be totally deserted except for Wilder and himself. The real duel would be resolved among the deserted corridors and abandoned apartments of the building inside their heads, watched only by the birds. Now that she had accepted it, the threat of violence in the air had matured Anne. Standing by the fireplace in the columnist drawing-room, Royal watched her with affection. She was no longer flirting with the elderly businessmen and young entrepreneurs, but listening intently to Dr. Pangborn, as if aware that the gynecologist might be useful to her in more ways than the purely professional. Despite his pleasure in displaying her to the other residents, Royal felt far more protective of her. This sexual territoriality extended to Jane Sheridan. "Have you thought about moving in with us?" he asked her. "Your own apartment is very much exposed." "I'd like to. Anne did mention it. I've already brought some things over." Royal danced with her in the garbage-stacked hallway, openly feeling her strong hips and thighs, as if this inventory established his claim to these portions of her body at a future date. Hours later, at some period after midnight when it seemed to Royal that these parties had been going on forever, he found himself drunk in an empty apartment on the 39th floor. He was lying back on a settee with Jane against his shoulder, surrounded by tables loaded with dirty glasses and ashtrays, all the debris of a party abandoned by its guests. The music from the balconies nearby was overlaid by the noise of sporadic acts of violence. Somewhere, a group of residents were shouting in a desultory way, hammering on the doors of an elevator shaft. A power failure had switched out the lights. Royal lay back in the darkness, steadying his slowly rotating brain against the illumination of the nearby high-rise. Without thinking, he began to caress Jane, stroking her heavy breast. She made no attempt to pull herself away from him. A few moments later, when the electric power returned, lighting up a single table lamp lying on the floor of the balcony, she recognized Royal and settled herself across him. Hearing a noise from the kitchen, Royal looked around to see his wife sitting at the table in her long gown, one hand on the electric coffee percolator as it began to warm. Royal put his arms around Jane and embraced her with a deliberate slowness, as if repeating for his wife's benefit a slow-motion playback. He knew that Anne could see them, but she sat quietly at the kitchen table, lighting a cigarette. During the sexual act that followed, she watched them without speaking, as if she approved, not from any fashionable response to marital infidelity, but from what Royal realized was a sense of tribal solidarity, a complete deference to the clan leader. Chapter 10. The Drained Lake. Soon after dawn the next morning, Robert Lang sat on his balcony on the 25th floor, eating a frugal breakfast and listening to the first sounds of activity in the apartments around him. Already a few residents were leaving the building on their way to work, picking their way through the debris underfoot towards their garbage-speckled cars. Several hundred people still left each day for their offices and studios, airports and auction rooms. Despite the scarcity of water and heating, the men and women were well-dressed and groomed, their appearance giving no hint of the events of the previous weeks. However, without realizing it, many of them would spend much of their time at their offices, asleep at their desks. Lang ate his slice of bread with methodical slowness. Sitting there on the cracked balcony of tiles, he felt like a poor pilgrim who had set out on a hazardous vertical journey and was performing a simple but meaningful ritual at a wayside shrine. The previous night had brought total chaos. Drunken parties, brawls, the looting of empty apartments, and assaults on any isolated resident. Several more floors were now in darkness, including the 22nd, where his sister Alice lived. Hardly anyone had slept. Amazingly, few people showed any signs of fatigue, as if the economy of their lives was switching from day to night. Lang half suspected that the insomnia so many of his neighbors had suffered had been some kind of unconscious preparation for the emergency ahead. He himself felt alert and confident. Despite the bruises on his shoulder and arms, he was physically in fine trim. At 8 o'clock, he intended to clean himself up and leave for the medical school. Lang had spent the early part of the night straightening Charlotte Melville's apartment, which had been ransacked by intruders while she and her small son were sheltering with friends. Later he had helped to guard an elevator which his neighbors had seized for a few hours. Not that they had gone anywhere. Having commandeered the elevator, what mattered was to hold it for an effective psychological interval. The evening had begun, as usual, with a party held by Paul Crosland, television newsreader and now clan chief. Crosland had been delayed at the studios, but his guests watched him deliver the 9 o'clock news, speaking in his familiar, well-modulated voice about a rush-hour pile-up in which 6 people had died. As his neighbors stood around the television set, Lang waited for Crosland to refer to the equally calamitous events taking place in the high-rise, the death of the jeweler, now totally forgotten, and the division of the tenants into rival camps. Perhaps, at the end of the newscast, he would add a special message for his clan members at that moment fixing their drinks among the plastic rubbish sacks in his living room. By the time Crosland arrived, swerving into the apartment in his fleece-lined jacket and boots like a returning bomber pilot, everyone was drunk. Flushed and excited, Eleanor Powell swayed up to Lang, pointing hilariously at him and accusing him of trying to break into her apartment. Everyone cheered this news, as if rape was a valuable and well-tried means of bringing clan members together. "A low crime rate, Doctor," she told him amiably, "is a sure sign of social deprivation." Drinking steadily, and without any self-control, Lang felt the alcohol bolt through his head. He knew that he was deliberately provoking himself, repressing any reservations about the good sense of people such as Crosland. On a practical level, being drunk was almost the only way of getting close to Eleanor Powell. Sober, she soon became tiresomely maudlin, wandering about the corridors in a vacant way as if she had lost the keys to her own mind. After a few cocktails, she was hyper-animated and flicked on and off like a confused TV monitor revealing glimpses of extraordinary programs which Lang could only understand when he was drunk himself. Although she kept overruling everything he said, tripping over the plastic garbage sacks under the bar, he held her upright, excited by the play of her hands across his lapels. Not for the first time, Lang reflected that he and his neighbors were eager for trouble as the most effective means of enlarging their sex lives. Lang emptied the coffee percolator over the edge of the balcony. A greasy spray hung across the face of the building. The residue of the cascade of debris now heaved over the side without a care whether the wind would carry it into the apartments below. He carried his breakfast tray into the kitchen. The continuing failure of the electricity supply had destroyed the food in the refrigerator. Bottles of sour milk stood in a mold-infested line. Rancid butter dripped through the grills. The smell of this rotting food was not without its appeal, but Lang opened a plastic sack and scooped everything into it. He slung the sack into the corridor, where it lay in the dim light with a score of others. A group of his neighbors was arguing in the elevator lobby, voices raised. A minor confrontation was developing between them and the 28th floor residents. Crosland was bellowing aggressively into the empty elevator shaft. Usually at this early hour of the day, Lang would have paid no attention to him. Too often Crosland had no idea what he was arguing about. Confrontation was enough. Without his makeup, the expression of outrage on his face made Crosland resemble an announcer tricked for the first time into reading an item of bad news about himself. From the shadows outside his door, the orthodontic surgeon emerged with studied casualness. Steele and his hard-faced wife had been standing among the garbage sacks for some time, keeping an eye on everything. He sidled up to Lang and took his arm in a gentle but complex grip, the kind of hold he might have used for an unusual extraction. He pointed to the floors above. "They want to seal the doors, permanently," he explained. "They're going to rewire 2 of the elevator circuits so that they move non-stop from the ground floor to the 28th. "What about the rest of us?" Lang asked. "How do we leave the building?" "My dear Lang, I don't suppose they care very much about us," Their real intention is to divide the building in half, here at the 20th floor. This is a key level for the electrical services. Services. By knocking out the 3 floors below us, they will have a buffer zone separating the top half of the building from the lower. Let's make sure, Doctor, that when this happens, we are on the right side of the buffers. He broke off as Lang's sister approached, carrying her electric coffee pot. With a bow, Steele moved away through the shadows, his small feet stepping deftly among the garbage sacks, the center parting of hair gleaming in the faint light. Lang watched him slide noiselessly into his apartment. No doubt Steele would pick his way with equal skill through the hazards ahead. He never left the building now, Lang had noticed. What had happened to that ruthless ambition? After the battles of the past weeks, he was presumably banking on an imminent upsurge in the demand for advanced surgery of the mouth. As Lang greeted Alice, he realized that she too would be excluded if the surgeon was right, living in the darkness on the wrong side of the dividing line with her alcoholic husband. She had come up ostensibly to plug her coffee pot into the power point in Lang's kitchen, but when they entered the apartment, she left it absently on the hall table. She walked onto the balcony and stared into the morning air, as if glad to have the 3 extra floors beneath her. "How is Charles?" Lang asked. "Is he at the office?" "No. He's taken some leave. Terminal, if you ask me. What about you? You shouldn't neglect your students. At the present rate, we're going to need every one of them." "I'm going in this morning. Would you like me to have a look at Charles on my way?" Alice ignored this offer. She grasped the handrail and began to rock herself like a child. "It's peaceful up here. Robert, you've no idea what it's like for most people." Lang laughed aloud, amused by Alice's notion that somehow she had been unaffected by events in the high-rise. The typical assumption of a martyred older sister forced during her childhood to look after a much younger brother. "Come whenever you want to." Lang put his arm around her shoulders, steadying her in case she lost her balance. In the past he'd always felt physically distanced from Alice by her close resemblance to their mother, but for reasons not entirely sexual this resemblance now aroused him. He wanted to touch her hips, place his hand over her breast. As if aware of this, she leaned passively against him. "Use my kitchen this evening," Lang told her. "From what I've heard, everything is going to be chaotic. It'll be safer here." "All right, but your apartment is so dirty." "I'll clean it for you." Checking himself, Lang looked down at his sister. Did she realize what was happening? Without intending to, they were arranging an assignation. All over the high-rise, people were packing their bags, readying themselves for short but significant journeys, a few floors up or down, laterally to the other end of a corridor. A covert but nonetheless substantial movement of marital partners was taking place. Charlotte Melville was now involved with a statistician on the 29th floor, and had almost vacated her apartment. Lang had watched her leave without resentment. Charlotte needed someone who would bring out her forcefulness and grit. Thinking about her, Lang felt a pang of regret that he himself had found no one. But perhaps Alice would give him the practical support he needed, with her now unfashionable dedication to the domestic virtues. Although he disliked her shrewish manner with its unhappy reminders of their mother, it gave him an undeniable sense of security. Holding her shoulders, he looked up at the roof of the high-rise. It seemed months since he had visited the observation deck, but for the first time he felt no urge to do so. He would build his dwelling place where he was, with this woman, and in this cave in the cliff face. When his sister had gone, Lang began to prepare for his visit to the medical school. Sitting on the kitchen floor, he looked up at the unwashed plates and utensils stacked in the sink. He was leaning comfortably against a plastic sack filled with rubbish. Seeing the kitchen from this unfamiliar perspective, he realized how derelict it had become. The floor was strewn with debris, scraps of food, and empty cans. To his surprise, Lang counted 6 garbage sacks. For some reason, he had assumed there was only one. Lang wiped his hands on his dirt-stained trousers and shirt. Reclining against this soft bed of his own waste, He felt like going to sleep. With an effort, he roused himself. A continuous decline had been taking place for some time, a steady erosion of standards that affected not only the apartment, but his own personal habits and hygiene. To some extent, this was forced on him by the intermittent water and electricity supply, the failure of the garbage disposal system. But it also reflected a falling interest in civilized conventions of any kind. None of his neighbors cared what food they ate. Neither Lang nor his friends had prepared a decent meal for weeks, and had reached a point where they opened a can at random whenever they felt hungry. By the same token, no one cared what they drank, interested only in getting drunk as quickly as possible and blunting whatever sensibilities were left to them. Lang had not played one of his carefully built-up library of records for weeks. Even his language had begun to coarsen. He picked at the thick rims of dirt under his nails. This decline, both of himself and his surroundings, was almost to be welcomed. In a way, he was forcing himself down these steepening gradients, like someone descending into a forbidden valley. The dirt on his hands, his stale clothes and declining hygiene, his fading interest in food and drink, all helped to expose a more real vision of himself. Lang listened to the intermittent noises from the refrigerator. The electricity had come on again, and the machine was sucking currents from the mains. Water began to trickle from the taps as the pumps started to work. Spurring himself on with Alice's criticisms, Lang wandered around the apartment, doing what he could to straighten the furniture. But half an hour later, as he carried a garbage sack from the kitchen into the hallway, he suddenly stopped. He dropped the sack onto the floor, realizing that he had achieved nothing. All he was doing was rearranging the dirt. Far more important was the physical security of the apartment, particularly while he was away. Lang strode down the long bookcase in the sitting room, pulling his medical and scientific textbooks onto the floor. Section by section he wrenched out the shelving. He carried the planks into the hall, and for the next hour moved around the apartment, transforming its open interior into a homemade blockhouse. All pieces of heavy furniture, the dining table and a hand-carved oak chest in his bedroom, he pulled into the hall. With the armchairs and desk, he constructed a solid barricade. When he was satisfied with this, he moved his food supplies from the kitchen into the bedroom. His resources were meager, but would keep him going for several days. Bags of rice, sugar and salt, cans of beef and pork, and a stale loaf of bread. Now that the air conditioning had ceased, the rooms soon became stuffy. Recently Lang had noticed a strong but not unpleasant smell, the characteristic odor of the apartment. Himself. Lang stripped off his grimy sports shirt and washed himself in the last water flowing from the shower. He shaved and put on a fresh shirt and suit. If he visited the medical school looking like a tramp, he might give away to some sharp-eyed colleague what was actually going on in the high-rise. He examined himself in the wardrobe mirror. The gaunt, white-skinned figure with the bruised forehead standing awkwardly in an over-large business suit looked totally unconvincing, like a discharged convict in his release suit blinking at the unfamiliar daylight after a long prison sentence. After tightening the bolts on the front door, Lang let himself out of the apartment. Fortunately, leaving the high-rise was easier than moving around within it. Like an unofficial subway service, one elevator still traveled by mutual consent to and from the main entrance lobby during office hours. However, the atmosphere of tension and hostility, the complex of overlapping internal sieges, was apparent everywhere. Barricades of lobby furniture and plastic sacks filled with garbage blocked the entrances to individual floors. Not only the lobby and corridor walls, but the ceilings and carpets were covered with slogans, a jumble of coded signals that marked the attacks of raiding parties from floors above and below. Lang had to restrain himself from penciling the number of his own floor among the numerals, some 3 feet high, emblazoned across the walls of the elevator car like the entries in a lunatic ledger. Almost everything possible had been vandalized, lobby mirrors fractured, payphones torn out, sofa upholstery slashed. The degree of vandalism was deliberately excessive, almost as if it served a more important secondary role, disguising the calculated way in which the residents of the high-rise, by ripping out all the phone lines, were cutting themselves off from the outside world. For a few hours each day, a system of informal truce routes opened like fracture lines throughout the building. but this period was becoming progressively shorter. Residents moved around the building in small groups, sharply on the lookout for any strangers. Each of them wore his floor level on his face like a badge. During this brief armistice of 4 or 5 hours they could move about, contestants in a ritualized ladder battle allowed between bouts to mount the rungs of their preordained ranks. Lang and his fellow passengers waited as the car made its slow descent, frozen together like mannequins in a museum tableau. Late 20th century high-rise dweller. When they reached the ground floor, Lang walked cautiously through the entrance, past the shuttered manager's office and the sacks of unsorted mail. He had not been to the medical school for days, and as he stepped through the glass door he was struck immediately by the cooler light and air, like the harsh atmosphere of an alien planet. A sense of strangeness, far more palpable than anything within the building, extended around the apartment block on all sides, reaching across the concrete plazas and causeways of the development project. Looking over his shoulder, as if maintaining a mental lifeline to the building, Lang walked across the parking lot. Hundreds of broken bottles and cans lay among the cars. A health engineer from the central office of the project had called the previous day, but left within half an hour, satisfied that these signs of breakdown were no more than teething troubles in the building's waste disposal system. As long as the residents made no formal complaint, no action would be taken. Lang was no longer surprised by the way in which the residents, who only a few weeks earlier had been united in their anger over the breakdown of the building's services, were now just as united in assuring any outsiders that all was well, partly out of a displaced pride in the high-rise, but also out of a need to resolve the confrontation between them without interference, like rival gangs battling across a refuse tip who joined forces to expel any intruder. Lang reached the center of the parking lot, only 200 yards from the neighboring high-rise, a sealed rectilinear planet whose glassy face he could now see clearly. Almost all the new tenants had moved into their apartments, duplicating to the last curtain fabric and dishwasher those in his own block. But this building seemed remote and threatening. Looking up at the endless tiers of balconies, he felt uneasily like a visitor to a malevolent zoo, where terraces of vertically mounted cages contained creatures of random and ferocious cruelty. A few people leaned on their railings and watched Lang without expression, and he had a sudden image of the 2,000 residents springing to their balconies and hurling down at him anything to hand, inundating Lang beneath a pyramid of wine bottles and ashtrays, deodorant aerosols, and contraceptive wallets. Lang reached his car and leaned against the window pillar. He knew that he was testing himself against the excitements of the world outside, exposing himself to its hidden dangers. For all its present conflict, the high-rise represented safety and security. Feeling the warm cellulose of the window pillar against his shoulder, Lang remembered the stale air in his apartment, tepid with the smell of his own body. By comparison, the brilliant light reflected off the chromium trim of the hundreds of cars filled the air with knives. He turned away from his car and walked along the parking lane that ran parallel to the apartment building. He was not yet ready to venture into the open air, face his colleagues at the medical school, catch up on the lost student supervisions. Perhaps he would stay at home that afternoon and prepare his notes for his next lecture. He reached the edge of the ornamental lake, a graceful oval 200 yards in length, and stepped down onto the concrete floor. Following a shadow, he walked along the gently sloping lake bed. Within a few minutes he was standing in the center of the empty lake. The damp concrete, like the surface of an enormous mold, curved away on all sides, smooth and bland, but in some way as menacing as the contours of some deep reductive psychosis. The absence of any kind of rigid rectilinear structure summed up for Lang all the hazards of the world beyond the high-rise. Unable to stay there any longer, he turned and strode swiftly towards the shore, climbed the bank and ran towards the apartment building between the dusty cars. Within 10 minutes he had returned to his apartment. After bolting the door, he climbed over his barricade and wandered around the half-empty rooms. As he inhaled the stale air, he was refreshed by his own odor, almost recognizing parts of his body, his feet and genitalia, the medley of smells that issued from his mouth. He stripped off his clothes in the bedroom throwing his suit and tie into the bottom of the closet, and putting on again his grimy sports shirt and trousers. He knew, now, that he would never again try to leave the high-rise. He was thinking about Alice, and how he could bring her to his apartment. In some way, these powerful odors were beacons that would draw her to him. Chapter 11. Punitive Expeditions. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the last of the residents had returned to the high-rise. From his balcony, Lang watched their cars appear on the approach roads and turn into their spaces in the parking lot. Briefcases in hand, the drivers made their way to the entrance lobbies. Lang was relieved that all conversation ended when they neared the building. This civilized behavior in some way unsettled him. Lang had rested during the afternoon, deciding to calm himself and gather his strength for the night to come. At intervals he climbed over the barricade and peered into the corridor, hoping to catch sight of Steele. Lang's concern for his sister, only 3 floors below with her twilight husband, made him increasingly restless. He needed an outbreak of violence to provide a pretext to rescue her. If the plan to divide the building succeeded, he would be unlikely to see her again. Lang paced around the apartment, testing the primitive defensive preparations. Those residents like himself on the upper floors were more vulnerable than they assumed, and might easily find themselves at the mercy of those on the lower levels. Wilder and his henchmen could easily block the exits, destroy the electrical and water supply inputs, and set fire to the upper floors. Lang imagined the first flames climbing through the elevator shafts and staircases, floors collapsing as the terrified residents were driven to find refuge on the roof. Unsettled by this lurid vision, Lang disconnected his stereo speakers and added them to the barricade of furniture and kitchen appliances. Records and cassettes lay about underfoot, but he kicked them out of the way. At the base of his bedroom wardrobe, he prized away the floorboards. In this suitcase-sized cavity, he hid away his checkbook and insurance policies, tax returns and share certificates. Lastly, he forced in his medical case with vials of morphine, antibiotics, and cardiac stimulants. When he nailed the floorboards back into place, he felt that he was sealing away forever the last residues of his previous life, and preparing himself without reservation for the new one to come. On the surface, the apartment building remained quiet, but much to Lang's relief, the first incidents broke out by the early evening. He waited in the lobby through the late afternoon, standing about with a group of his fellow residents. Perhaps insanely, nothing was going to happen. Then a foreign affairs analyst arrived with the news that there had been a fierce scuffle over an elevator 10 floors below. Adrian Talbot, the likable psychiatrist on the 27th floor, had been drenched in urine as he climbed the stairs to his apartment. There was even a rumor that a 40th floor apartment had been vandalized. Such an act of provocation guaranteed them all a hot night. This was followed by a spate of reports that many residents had returned home to find their apartments ransacked, furniture and kitchen equipment damaged, electrical fittings torn out. Oddly enough, no food supplies had been touched, as if these acts of vandalism were deliberately random and meaningless. Had the damage been inflicted by the owners themselves, without realizing what they were doing, in an attempt to bring about an increase in violence? These incidents continued as the evening settled over in the apartment building. From his balcony, Lang could see torch beams flicking to and fro in the windows of the 8 blacked-out floors below, as if signaling the preparations of a brutal blood rite. Lang sat in the darkness on the living-room carpet, his back against the reassuring bulk of the barricade. He was reluctant to switch on the lights for fear, absurdly as he knew, that an assailant might attack him from the air outside his balcony. Drinking steadily from a hip flask of whiskey, he watched the early evening television programs. He turned down the sound, not out of boredom with these documentaries and situation comedies, but because they were meaningless. Even the commercials, with their concern for the realities of everyday life, were transmissions from another planet. Squatting among the plastic garbage sacks, his furniture piled up behind him, Lang studied these lavish reconstructions of housewives cleaning their immaculate kitchens, deodorant spraying well-groomed armpits. Together they formed the elements of a mysterious domestic universe. Calm and unfrightened, Lang listened to the strident voices in the corridor. Thinking about his sister, he welcomed these signs of the violence to come. Alice, always fastidious, would probably be repelled by the derelict state of the apartment, but it would do her good to find something to criticize. The sweat on Lang's body, like the plaque that coated his teeth, surrounded him in an envelope of dirt and body odor, but the stench gave him confidence, the feeling that he had dominated the terrain with the products of his own body. Even the prospect that the lavatory would soon be permanently blocked, something that had once filled him with polite dread, was now almost inviting. This decline in standards of hygiene Lang shared with his neighbors. Emitted from their bodies was a strong scent, the unique signature of the high-rise. The absence of this odor was what most unsettled him about the world outside the apartment block, though its nearest approximation was to be found in the dissecting room at the anatomy school. A few days earlier, Lang had caught himself hanging about his secretary's desk, trying to get close enough to her to detect this reassuring smell. The startled girl had looked up to find Lang hovering over her like a beachcomber in rut. 3 floors above, a falling bottle burst across a balcony. The glass fragments spat away like tracers through the darkness. A record player by an open window was turned up to full volume. Huge fragments of amplified music boomed into the night. Lang climbed around his barricade and unlocked the door of his apartment. In the elevator lobby, a group of his neighbors were manhandling a steel fire door across the entrance to the stairway. 5 floors below, a raid was in progress. Lang and his fellow clansmen crowded against the fire door, peering into the darkened stairwell. They could hear the elevator gear reverberating as the car moved up and down, ferrying more attackers to the fray. Rising from the 20th floor, as if from an execution pit, came a woman's scream. Waiting for Steele to appear and help them, Lang was about to go in search of him. But the lobby and corridors were filled with running people, colliding into each other in the dark as they fought their way back to their apartments on the floors above the 25th. The raiders had been hurled back. Torch beams swerved across the walls in a lunatic semaphore. Lang slipped in a pool of grease and fell among the swerving shadows. Behind him, an excited woman stepped on his hand, her heel cutting his wrist. For the next 2 hours, a series of running battles took place in the corridors and staircases, moving up and down the floors as the barricades were reassembled and torn down again. At midnight, as he crouched in the elevator lobby behind the overturned fire door, debating whether to risk making a run for Alice's apartment, Lang saw Richard Wilder standing among the scattered steel chairs. In one hand he still held his cinecamera. Like a large animal pausing for breath, he followed the huge projections of himself cast upon the walls and ceiling, as if about to leap onto the backs of his own shadows and ride them like a troop of beasts up the flues of the building. The confrontation subsided, moving away like a storm towards the lower floors. Lang and his neighbors assembled in Adrian Talbot's apartment. Here they sat on the living room floor, among the broken tables and the easy chairs with their slashed cushions. The torches at their feet formed a circle of light, shining on the bottles of whiskey and vodka they shared together. Arm in a sling, the psychiatrist moved around his vandalized apartment, trying to hang the shattered picture frames over the slogans aerosoled across his walls in the supermarket paint section's most fashionable colors. Talbot seemed more numbed by the personal hostility in these anti-homosexual obscenities than by the wholesale destruction of his apartment. But in spite of himself, Lang found them stimulating. The lurid caricatures on the walls glimmered in the torchlight like the priapic figures drawn by cave-dwellers. "At least they've left you alone," Talbot said, crouching beside Lang. "I've obviously been picked out as a scapegoat. This building must have been a powerhouse of resentments. Everyone's working off the most extraordinary backlog of infantile aggressions." "They'll spend themselves." "Perhaps. I had a bucket of urine thrown over me this afternoon. Much more of that, and I may take up a cudgel myself. It's a mistake to imagine that we're all moving towards a state of happy primitivism. The model here seems to be less the noble savage than our own uninnocent post-Freudian selves, outraged by all that overindulgent toilet training, dedicated breastfeeding, and parental affection, obviously a more dangerous mix than anything our Victorian forebears had to cope with." Our neighbors had happy childhoods to a man and still feel angry. Perhaps they resent never having had a chance to become perverse. As they nursed their bruises and passed around the bottles, drinking steadily to build up their courage, Lang listened to the talk of counterattack and revenge. There was still no sign of Steele. For some reason, Lang felt that he should have been there, a future leader more important to them than Crosland. In spite of his injuries, Lang felt exhilarated and confident, eager to return to the fray. The darkness was reassuring, providing its own security, the natural medium of their life in the apartment building. He felt proud of having learned how to move around the pitched black corridors, never more than 3 steps at a time, how to pause and test the darkness, and even the right way of crossing his own apartment, always keeping as close to the floor as possible. He almost resented the daylight which the following morning would bring. The true light of the high-rise was the metallic flash of the Polaroid camera, that intermittent radiation which recorded a moment of hoped-for violence for some later voyeuristic pleasure. What depraved species of electric flora would spring to life from the garbage-strewn carpets of the corridors in response to this new source of light? The floors were littered with the blackened negative strips, flakes falling from this internal sun. Muddled by alcohol and excitement, Lang clambered to his feet with his neighbors as they set off like a crowd of drunken students, brawling with each other to keep up their courage. By the time they had descended 3 floors in the darkness, Lang had lost his bearings. They had entered an enclave of abandoned apartments on the 22nd floor. They wandered around the deserted rooms, kicking in the faces of television sets, breaking up the kitchen crockery. Trying to clear his head before going to rescue his sister, Lang vomited over a balcony rail. The threads of luminous phlegm fell away across the face of the building. Leaning there in the darkness, he listened to his neighbors moving along the corridor. When they had gone, he would be able to look for Alice. Behind him, the electric lights came on. Startled, Lang flinched against the parapet, expecting an intruder to attack him. After a brief interval, the lights began to flicker continuously like a fibrillating heart. Lang looked down at his grimy clothes and vomit-stained hands. The vandalized living room glimmered around him, the floor strewn with debris as if he had woken on a battlefield. In the bedroom, a broken mirror lay on the bed, the pieces flickering like the fragments of another world trying unsuccessfully to reconstitute itself. "Come in, Lang," the familiar, precise voice of the orthodontic surgeon called out to him. "There's something interesting here." Steele was circling the room with a sword stick in one hand. Now and then he feinted at the floor in a teasing way, as if rehearsing a scene from a melodrama. He beckoned Lang forward into the stuttering light. Lang cautiously approached the door, glad to see Steele at last, but well aware of how exposed he was to any passing whim of his. He assumed that Steele had trapped the apartment's owner, or a vagrant resident who had taken shelter here, but there was no one in the room. Then, following the blade of the sword stick, he saw that Steele had cornered a small cat between the legs of the dressing table. Steele lunged forward, twirling a brocade curtain he had wrenched from the window, and whirled the terrified creature into the bathroom. "Wait, Doctor!" The surgeon's voice was infused with a strangely cold gaiety, like an erotic machine's. "Don't leave yet." The lights continued to flicker with the harsh over-reality of an atrocity newsreel. Confused by his own response, Lang watched Steele manipulate the cat under the curtain. By some ugly logic, the dentist's pleasure in tormenting the creature was doubled by the presence of a squeamish but fascinated witness. Lang stood in the bathroom doorway, hoping despite himself that the lights would not fail again. He waited as Steele calmly smothered the cat, destroying it under the curtain, as if carrying out a complex resuscitation under a hospital blanket. Pulling himself away at last, Lang left without speaking. He moved carefully along the darkened corridor as the lights flickered from the doorways of ransacked apartments. From overturned lamps lying on the floor and television screens brought back to a last intermittent life. A faint music played somewhere around him. An abandoned record turntable was spinning again. In an empty bedroom, a cineprojector screened the last feed of a pornographic film onto the wall facing the bed. When he reached Alice's apartment, Lang hesitated, uncertain how to explain his presence. But as his sister opened the door and beckoned him in, he saw immediately that she had known he was coming. 2 suitcases, already packed, stood in the living room. Alice walked to the door of her bedroom for the last time. In the yellow, intermittent light, Frobisher was slumped asleep on the bed, a half-empty case of whiskey beside him. Alice took Lang's arm. "You're late," she said reprovingly. "I've been waiting for hours." As they left, she made no attempt to look back at her husband. Husband. Lang remembered Alice and himself at home, years earlier, and how once they had slipped out of the drawing-room in the same way as their mother lay unconscious on the floor after injuring herself during a drinking bout. The sounds of a minor clash echoed up the stairwell as they made their way to the safety of the darkness of the 25th floor. 15 floors, including Lang's own, were now permanently without light. Like a storm reluctant to end, recapitulating itself at intervals, the violence rumbled on throughout the night as Lang and his sister lay awake together on the mattress in his bedroom. Chapter 12. Towards the Summit. Soon after 2 o'clock in the afternoon 4 days later, Richard Wilder returned from his television station and drove into the parking lot beside the high-rise. Reducing speed so that he could relish to the full this moment of arrival, he sat back comfortably behind the wheel and looked up with a confident eye at the face of the apartment building. Around him the long ranks of parked cars were covered with a thickening layer of dirt and cement dust, blown across the open plazas of the development project from the road junction under construction behind the medical center. Few cars now left the parking lot, and there were almost no free spaces, but Wilder drove up and down the access lanes, stopping at the end of each file and reversing back to his starting point. Wilder fingered the freshly healed scar on his unshaven chin, relic of a vigorous corridor battle the previous night. Deliberately he reopened the wound and glanced with satisfaction at the point of blood on his finger. He had driven from the television station at speed, as if trying to emerge from an angry dream, shouting and sounding the horn at other drivers in his way, cutting up one-way streets. Now he felt calm and relaxed. The first sight of the line of 5 apartment buildings soothed him, as usual, providing a context of reality absent from the studios. Confident that he would find a free space, Wilder continued his patrol. Originally he had parked, along with his neighbors on the lower floors, in the ranks along the perimeter of the parking lot, but during the previous weeks he had begun moving his car nearer to the building. What had begun as a harmless piece of vanity, an ironic joke at his own expense, had soon taken on a more serious role, a visible index of his success or failure. After several weeks dedicated to his ascent of the building, he felt entitled to park in those files reserved for his new neighbors. Ultimately, he would reach the front rank. At the moment of his triumph, when he climbed to the 40th floor, his car would join the line of expensive wrecks nearest the apartment block. For several hours the previous night, Wilder had reached the 20th floor, and even, during the few minutes of an unexpected skirmish, the 25th. By dawn, he had been forced to retire from this advanced position to his present base camp, an apartment on the 17th floor owned by a stage manager at the television station, a former drinking companion named Hillman, who had grudgingly accepted this cuckoo in his nest. The occupation of a floor, in Wilder's strict sense of the term, meant more than the casual seizure of an abandoned apartment. Dozens of these were scattered throughout the high-rise. Wilder had imposed on himself a harder definition of ascent. He had to be accepted by his new neighbors as one of them, the holder of a tenancy won by something other than physical force. In short, he insisted that they need him. When he thought about it, a notion that made him snort. He had reached the 20th floor as a result of one of the many demographic freaks that had confused his progress through the building. During the running battles that had filled the night, he found himself helping to barricade the damaged door of an apartment on the 20th floor, owned by 2 women stock market analysts. After trying to brain him with a champagne bottle as he pushed his head through the broken panel, they had welcomed Wilder's easygoing offer to help. He deliberately was never more calm than at these moments of crisis. In fact, the older of the 2, a spirited blonde of 30, had complimented Wilder on being the only sane man she had met in the high-rise. For his part, Wilder was glad to play a domestic role rather than the populist leader and Bonaparte of the elevator lobby barricades, instructing an ill-trained militia of magazine editors and finance copy executives in how to storm a defended staircase or capture a rival elevator. Apart from anything else, the higher up the building he climbed, the worse the physical condition of the residents. Hours on the gymnasium exercycles had equipped them for no more than hours on the gymnasium exercycles. After helping the two women, he spent the period before dawn drinking their wine and maneuvering them into making the suggestion that he move into their apartment. As usual, he gestured grandly with his cine camera and told them about his television documentary on the high-rise, inviting them to appear on screen. But neither was particularly impressed by the offer. Although the lower-level tenants were keen to take part in the program and vent their grievances, the people living on the upper floors had appeared on television already, often more than once, as professional experts on various current affairs programs. "Television is for watching, Wilder," one of the women told him firmly, "not for appearing on." Soon after dawn, the members of a women's raiding party appeared. Their husbands and companions had either moved in with friends on other floors or exited from their lives altogether. The leader of the pack, the elderly children's story writer, gazed balefully at Wilder when he offered her the starring role in his documentary. Taking the hint, Wilder bowed out and returned to his previously secure base, the Hillman's apartment on the 17th floor. 30 feet away, as Wilder drove around the parking lot, determined to find a rank in keeping with his new station, a bottle shattered across a car roof, vanishing in a brittle cloudburst. The bottle had been dropped from a height conceivably from the 40th floor. Wilder slowed his car almost to a halt. Offering himself as a target, he half expected to see the white-jacketed figure of Anthony Royal standing in one of his messianic poses on the parapet of his penthouse, the white Alsatian at his heels. During the past days he had caught several glimpses of the architect, standing high above Wilder at the top of a staircase, disappearing in a commandeered elevator towards the fastnesses of the top floors. Without any doubt, he was deliberately exposing himself to Wilder, tempting him upwards. At times Royal seemed to be uncannily aware of the confused image of his natural father that hovered in the attics of Wilder's mind, glimpsed always in the high windows of his nursery. Had Royal set out to play this role? Knowing that Wilder's confusions about his father would deflect his resolve to climb the building? Wilder drummed his heavy fists on the steering wheel. Each night he moved closer to Royal, a few steps nearer their ultimate confrontation. Broken glass crackled under his tires, as if unzipping the treads. Directly ahead of Wilder, in the front rank reserved for the top-floor residents, was a free space once occupied by the dead jeweler's car. Without hesitating, Wilder spun the wheel and steered into the open space. Not before time. He sat back expansively, gazing with pleasure at the garbage-strewn wrecks on either side. The appearance of the space was a good omen. He took his time getting out of the car and slammed the door aggressively. As he strode towards the entrance, he felt like a well-to-do landowner who had just bought himself a mountain. In the entrance lobby, a group of down-at-the-heel first-floor residents watched Wilder stride past the elevators to the stairway. They were suspicious of his movements around the building, his changing allegiances. During the day, Wilder spent a few hours with Helen and his sons in the second-floor apartment, trying to rally his increasingly withdrawn wife. Sooner or later, he would have to leave her forever. In the evenings, when he renewed his ascent of the high-rise, she would come alive a little, perhaps even speak to him about his work at the television studios, referring to programs on which he had worked years before. The previous night, as he prepared to leave, settling his sons and testing the locks on the doors, Helen had suddenly embraced him, as if wanting him to stay. The muscles of her thin face had moved through an irregular sequence of tremors, like tumblers trying to fall into place. To Wilder's surprise, when he returned to the apartment, he found Helen in a state of high excitement. He made his way around the garbage sacks and barricades of broken furniture that blocked the corridor. Helen and a group of wives were celebrating a minor triumph. The tired women with their unruly children, the civil war within the high-rise had made them as combative as their parents, formed a wistful tenement tableau. 2 young women from the 7th floor, who had once worked as teachers in junior school, had volunteered to reopen the classes. From their uneasy glances at the vigilante group of 3 fathers, a computer time salesman, a sound man, and a travel agency courier, standing between them and the door, Wilder guessed that they were the victims of a less than gentle abduction. As he prepared a meal from the last of the canned food, Helen sat at the kitchen table, her white hands moving about like a pair of confused birds in a cage.
"I can barely believe it. I'll be free of the boys for an hour or 2.
Where are these classes being held?"
"Here, for the next 2 mornings. It's the least I can do."
"But you won't be away from the boys at all." "Well, anything's better than nothing." Would she ever abandon the children, Wilder asked himself. It was all she thought about. As he played with his sons, he seriously considered taking them with him on his climb. He watched Helen, making a nervous effort to tidy the apartment. The living room had been ransacked during a raid. While Helen and the boys sheltered in a neighbor's apartment, most of the furniture had been broken, the kitchen kicked to a shambles. Helen carried the wrecked chairs from the dining room, lining them up in front of Wilder's broken-backed desk. The tilting chairs leaned against each other in a scarecrow parody of a children's classroom. Wilder made no effort to help. He watched her thin arms dragging at the furniture. At times, he almost suspected that she was deliberately exhausting herself, and that the bruises on her wrists and knees were part of an elaborate system of conscious self-mutilation, an attempt to win back her husband. Each day, when he returned home, he half expected to find her in an invalid chair, legs broken, and trepan bandage round her shaved head, about to take the last desperate step of lobotomy. Why did he keep coming back to her? His one ambition now was to get away from Helen, and overcome that need to return to the apartment each afternoon, and whatever threadbare links it maintained with his own childhood. By leaving Helen, he would break away from the whole system of juvenile restraints he had been trying to shake off since adolescence. Even his compulsive womanizing was part of the same attempt to free himself from the past, an attempt that Helen brought to nothing by turning a blind eye. At least, however, his affairs had prepared the ground for his ascent to the high-rise, those literal handholds which would carry him on his climb to the roof over the supine bodies of the women he had known. He found it difficult now to feel much involvement with his wife's plight, or with her neighbors and their narrow, defeated lives. Already it was clear that the lower floors were doomed. Even their insistence on educating their children, the last reflex of any exploited group before it sank into submission, marked the end of their resistance. Helen was even being helped now by the women's group from the 29th floor. During the noon armistice, the children's story writer and her minions moved through the apartment building, offering help to abandoned or isolated wives, sisters of sinister charity. Wilder went into his son's bedroom. Glad to see Wilder, they banged their empty feeding bowls with their plastic machine pistols. They were dressed in miniature paratroopers' camouflage suits and tin helmets. The wrong outfit, Wilder reflected, in the light of what had been taking place in the high-rise. The correct combat costume was stockbroker's pinstripe, briefcase, and Homburg. The boys were hungry. After calling to Helen, he returned to the kitchen. Helen was slumped on her knees in front of the electric cooker. The door was open, and Wilder had the sudden notion that she was trying to hide her small body in the oven, perhaps cook herself, the ultimate sacrifice for her family. "Helen." He bent down, surprised by the slightness of her body, a collection of sticks inside her pallid skin. "For heaven's sake, you're like—"
"It's all right. I'll have something later."
She pulled herself away from him and began to pick without thinking at the burnt fat on the oven floor. Looking down at her huddled at his feet, Wilder realized that she had momentarily fainted from hunger. Wilder let her subside against the cooker. He scanned the empty shelves of the pantry. "Stay here. I'll go up to the supermarket, get you something to eat." Angry with her, he snapped, "Why didn't you tell me that you were starving yourself?"
"Richard, I've mentioned it 100 times.
She watched him from the floor as he hunted in her purse for money, something Wilder had found less and less use for recently. He had not even bothered to pay his last salary check into his account. He picked up the cinecamera, making sure that the lens shroud was in place. As he looked back at Helen, he noticed that her eyes were surprisingly hard within her small face, almost as if she was amused by her husband's dependence on the fictions of this elaborate toy. Locking the apartment door behind him, Wilder set off in search of food and water. During the afternoon lull, one access route to the 10th-floor supermarket was still allowed the tenants in the lower section of the apartment building. Most of the stairways were blocked by permanent barricades, living room furniture, dining tables, and washing machines piled high between the steps and ceilings. 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 More than a dozen of the 20 elevators were out of order. The remainder functioned intermittently, at the whim of any superior clan. In the lobby, Wilder peered cautiously up the empty shafts. Sections of metal railing and water pipes crisscrossed the shafts, inserted like stop indicators to prevent the cars moving up or down, and almost formed a staircase of their own. The walls were covered with slogans and obscenities, lists of apartments to be vandalized like an insane directory. By the stairwell doors, a military-style message in sober lettering pointed to the one safe staircase to be used during the early afternoon, and the obligatory curfew time, 3 o'clock. Wilder raised his camera and stared at the message through the viewfinder. The shot would make a striking opening title sequence for the documentary on the high-rise. He was still aware of the need to make a visual record of what had happened within the apartment building, but the resolve had begun to fade. The decline of the apartment building reminded him of a slow-motion newsreel of a town in the Andes, being carried down the mountain slopes to its death, the inhabitants still hanging out their washing in the disintegrating gardens, cooking in their kitchens as the walls were pulverized around them. 20 of the floors in the high-rise were now in darkness at night, and over 100 apartments had been abandoned by their owners. The clan system, which had once given a measure of security to the residents, had now largely broken down, individual groups drifting into apathy or paranoia. Everywhere, people were retreating into their apartments, even into one room, and barricading themselves away. At the 5th-floor landing, Wilder paused, surprised that there was no one around. He waited by the lobby doors, listening for any suspicious sound. The tall figure of a middle-aged sociologist, garbage pail in hand, emerged from the shadows and drifted like a ghost along the refuse-strewn corridor. For all the building's derelict state, almost no water was flowing, the air-conditioning vents were blocked with garbage and excrement, rails ripped off the staircase balustrades. The behavior of the residents during the daylight hours for the most part remained restrained. At the 7th-floor landing, Wilder stopped and relieved himself against the steps. In a way, he was surprised by the sight of the urine running away between his feet. However, this was the mildest display of crudity. During the brawls and running battles of the night, he was aware that he took a distinct and unguilty pleasure in urinating wherever he cared, defecating in abandoned apartments regardless of the health hazards to himself and his family. The previous night he had enjoyed pushing around a terrified woman who remonstrated with him for relieving himself on her bathroom floor. Nonetheless, Wilder welcomed and understood the night. Only in the darkness could one become sufficiently obsessive, deliberately play on all one's repressed instincts. He welcomed this forced conscription of all the deviant strains in his character. Happily, this free and degenerate behavior became easier the higher he moved up the building, as if encouraged by the secret logic of the high-rise. The 10th-floor concourse was deserted. Wilder pushed back the staircase doors with their shattered glass and walked out onto the shopping mall. The bank had closed, along with the hairdressing salon and the liquor store. The last supermarket cashier, the wife of a cameraman on the 3rd floor, sat stoically at her checkout point, presiding like a doomed Britannia over a sea of debris. Wilder strolled around the empty shelves. Rotting packs floated in the greasy water at the bottom of the freezer cabinets. In the center of the supermarket, a pyramid of dog biscuit cartons had collapsed across the aisle. Wilder filled a basket with 3 of the cartons and a half a dozen cans of cat meat. Together they would keep Helen and the boys alive until he could break into an apartment and raid a food cache. "There's nothing here but pet food," he told the cashier at the checkout. "Have you stopped ordering?"
"There's no demand,"
she told him. She played absent-mindedly with an open wound on her forehead. Everyone must have stocked up months ago. This was not true, Wilder reflected as he walked away towards the elevator lobby, leaving her alone on the huge concourse. As he knew full well, having broken into any number of apartments, few people had any reserve supplies whatever. It was as if they were no longer giving any thought to what they might need the next day. 50 feet away, beyond the overturned hairdryers lying outside the salon, the elevator indicator lights moved from right to left. The last public elevator of the day was winding itself up the building. Somewhere between the 25th and 30th floors, it would be brought to a halt at the whim of a lookout, marking the end of the midday armistice and the beginnings of another night. Without thinking, Wilder quickened his pace. He reached the doors as the elevator paused at the 9th floor to discharge a passenger. At the last moment, as it resumed its ascent, Wilder pressed the button. In the few seconds that remained before the doors opened, he realized that he had already decided to abandon Helen and his sons for good. Only one direction lay before him. Up. Like a climber resting 100 feet from the summit, he had no option but to ascend. The elevator doors opened. Some 15 passengers faced him, standing rigidly together like plastic mannequins. There was a fractional movement of feet as a space was made for Wilder. Wilder hesitated, controlling his impulse to turn and run down the staircase to his apartment. The eyes of the passengers were fixed on him, wary of his indecision and suspecting that it might conceal a ruse of some kind. As the doors began to close, Wilder stepped forward into the elevator. The cinecamera raised in front of him and began once again his ascent of the high-rise. Chapter 13. Body Markings. After a delay of 20 minutes, as irritating as a hold-up at a provincial frontier post, the elevator moved from the 16th to the 17th floor. Exhausted by the long wait, Wilder stepped through the doors into the lobby, looking for somewhere to throw away his cartons of pet food. Crammed together shoulder to shoulder, the returning cost accountants and television executives held tightly to their briefcases, eyes averted from each other as they stared at the graffiti on the walls of the car. The steel roof had been removed, and the long shaft rose above their heads, exposed to anyone with a missile casually to hand. The 3 passengers who stepped out with Wilder vanished among the barricades that lined the dimly lit corridors. When Wilder reached the Hillmans' apartment, he found that the door was securely bolted. There were no sounds of movement from within. Wilder tried without success to force the lock. Conceivably the Hillmans had abandoned the apartment and taken shelter with friends. Then he heard a faint scraping from the hall. Pressing his head to the door, he heard Mrs. Hillman remonstrating with herself in a thin voice as she pulled a heavy object across the floor. After a prolonged tapping and negotiation, during which Wilder was obliged to speak to her in her own wheedling tone, he was admitted to the apartment. A huge barricade of furniture, units of kitchen equipment, books, clothes, and table ornaments blocked the hallway, a miniature municipal dump in its own right. Hillman lay on a mattress in the bedroom. His head was bandaged in a torn evening dress shirt, through which the blood had seeped onto the pillow. He raised his head as Wilder came in, his hand searching for a section of balcony railing on the floor behind him. Hillman had been one of the first scapegoats to be selected and attacked. His brusque and independent manner made him a natural target. During a raid on the next floor, he had been hit on the head by a television award winner's statuette as he tried to order his way up a defended staircase. Wilder had carried him back to his apartment and spent the night looking after him. With her husband out of commission, Mrs. Hellman depended totally on Wilder, a dependence that he himself in a way enjoyed. When Wilder was away, she spent all her time worrying about him, like an over-anxious mother fretting about a wayward child, though as soon as he arrived, she forgot who he was. She tugged at Wilder's sleeve as he looked down at Hillman. She was more concerned about her barricade than her husband, and his ominous disturbances of vision. Almost everything movable in the apartment, however small, she had added to the barricade, at times threatening to entomb them for good. Each night, Wilder slept through the few hours before dawn, slumped in an armchair partly embedded in the barricade. He would hear her, moving tirelessly around him, adding a small piece of furniture she had found somewhere, 3 books, a single gramophone record, her jewelry box. Once Wilder woke to find that she had incorporated part of his left leg. Often it would take him half an hour to dig his way out of the apartment.
"What is it?"
Wilder asked her irritably.
"What are you doing to my arm?"
She was peering at the bag of dog food, which Wilder, in the absence of any furniture, had been unable to put down. For some reason, he did not want it added to the barricade.
"I've been cleaning up for you," she told him with some pride. "You wanted me to, didn't you?"
"Of course."
Wilder gazed around the apartment in a lordly way. In fact, he barely noticed any changes, and if anything, preferred the apartment to be dirty.
"What's this?"
She poked excitedly at the carton, jabbing him roguishly in the ribs as if she had caught a small son with a secret present for her.
"You've got a surprise."
"Leave it alone."
Roughly, Wilder fended her away, almost knocking her off her feet. In a way, he enjoyed these absurd rituals. They touched levels of intimacy that had never been possible with Helen. The higher up the building he moved, the more free he felt to play these games. Mrs. Hillman wrestled a pack of dog biscuits out of the bag. Her small body was surprisingly agile. She gazed at the overweight basset hound on the label. Both she and her husband were as thin as scarecrows. Generously, Wilder handed her a can of cat meat.
"Soak the biscuits in gin. I know you've got a bottle hidden here somewhere. It'll do you both good."
"We'll get a dog."
When Wilder looked irritated by the suggestion, she sidled up to him, teasingly, pressing her hands against his heavy chest.
"A dog. Please, Dickie."
Wilder tried to move away from her, but the lewd, wheedling tone and the pressure of her fingers on his nipples unsettled him. Their unexpected sexual expertise excited a hidden strain in his character. Hillman, the dress shirt around his head like a bloody turban, was looking up passively at them, his face drained of all color. With his visual disturbances, Wilder reflected, the empty apartment would seem to be filled with embracing replicas of himself and Mrs. Hillman. He pretended to accost her, out of curiosity, running his hands over her buttocks, as small as apples, to see how the injured man would react. But Hillman gave no flicker of recognition. Wilder stopped stroking Mrs. Hillman when he saw that she was openly responding to him. It was on other levels that he wanted their relationship to develop.
"Dickie, I know why you came to rescue me."
Mrs. Hillman followed him around the barricade, still holding Wilder's arm.
"Will you punish them?"
This was another one of their games. Rescue. She visualized primarily in terms of making them, that is, all the residents in the high-rise below the 17th floor, eat humble pie and prostrate themselves in an endless line outside her front door.
"I'll punish them,"
Wilder reassured her.
"All right."
They were leaning against the barricade, Mrs. Hillman's sharp-chinned face against his chest. No more ill-suited couple, Wilder decided, could have been cast to play mock mother and mock son. Nodding eagerly at the prospect of revenge, Mrs. Hillman reached into the barricade and pulled at a black metal pipe. As it emerged, Wilder saw that it was the barrel of a shotgun. Surprised, Wilder took the weapon from her hands. As if expecting Wilder to go out into the corridor at that very moment and shoot someone dead, he broke the breach. 2 live shells were in place under the hammers. Wilder moved the weapon out of Mrs. Hillman's reach. He realized that this was probably only one of hundreds of similar firearms in the high-rise, sporting rifles, military service souvenirs, handbag pistols. But no one had fired a single shot, despite the epidemic of violence. Wilder knew perfectly well why. He himself would never bring himself to fire this shotgun, even at the point of death. There was an unspoken agreement among the residents of the high-rise that their confrontation would be resolved by physical means alone. He jammed the shotgun back into the barricade and pushed Mrs. Hillman in the chest.
"Go away, rescue yourself."
As she protested, half playfully, half in earnest, he began to throw dog biscuits at her, scattering them around the bare floor. Wilder enjoyed abusing her. Deriding her in front of her supine husband, he withheld the food from her until she broke down and retreated to the kitchen. The evening progressed happily. Wilder became more and more oafish as the darkness settled over the high-rise, deliberately coarsening himself like a delinquent youth fooling about with a besotted headmistress. Until 2 o'clock that morning, during a night intermittently disrupted by outbreaks of violence, Wilder remained within the Hillmans' apartment on the 17th floor. The marked decline in the number of incidents disturbed Wilder. For his ascent of the building, he relied on being able to offer himself as an aggressive street fighter to one or another of the warring groups. However, the open tribal conflicts of the previous week had now clearly ceased. With the breakdown of clan structure, the formal boundary and armistice lines had dissolved, giving way to a series of small enclaves, a cluster of 3 or 4 isolated apartments. These were far more difficult to penetrate and exploit. Sitting in the darkness on the floor of the sitting room with Mrs. Hillman, their backs to opposite walls, they listened to the muted noises around them. The residents of the high-rise were like creatures in a darkened zoo, lying together in surly quiet, now and then tearing at each other in brief acts of ferocious violence. The Hillmans' immediate neighbors, an insurance broker and his wife, 2 account executives and a pharmacologist, were listless and unorganized. Wilder had visited them several times, but found that appeals to self-advantage no longer roused them. In fact, only the most blatant expressions of irrational hostility could galvanize their glazed minds. Wilder's feigned and unfeigned rages, his fantasies of revenge, roused them briefly from their state of torpor. This regrouping around more radical and aggressive leaders was taking place all over the high-rise. In the hours after midnight, torches flared behind the barricades in the lobbies and corridors, where enclaves of 5 or 6 residents squatted among the plastic garbage sacks, inciting each other like wedding guests making themselves drunk in the knowledge that they, too, will soon be copulating freely among the sweetmeats. At 2 o'clock, Wilder left the Hillmans' apartment and set about stirring up his neighbors. The men crouched together, clubs and spears in hand, hip flasks of whiskey pooled at their feet. The torch beams illuminated the garbage sacks piled high around them, a visible museum of their leavings. Wilder sat in the center of the group, outlining his plans for another foraging expedition to the floors above. Although they had eaten little for days, his neighbors were reluctant to take part, fearful of the power of the residents above them. Skillfully, Wilder played on their fantasies. Once again, as his imaginary scapegoat, he selected the psychiatrist Adrian Talbot, whom he now accused of molesting a child in a swimming pool changing cubicle. The untruth of the accusation, which they all well knew, only served to reinforce it. However, before they could move, they insisted that Wilder invent an even more lurid crime, as if the imaginary nature of Talbot's sexual offenses held the essence of their appeal. By the logic of the high-rise, those most innocent of any offense became the most guilty. Shortly before dawn, Wilder found himself in an empty apartment on the 26th floor. Once occupied by a woman and her small son, the apartment had recently been abandoned, and no attempt had been made to padlock the door from the outside. Tired after the night's rampage, Wilder wasted no time in breaking down the door. He had sidestepped his raiding party, leaving them to break up Talbot's apartment for the 10th time. During these last minutes of darkness, he would settle himself into an empty apartment and sleep through the long hours of daylight in time to resume his ascent of the high-rise at dusk. Wilder moved around the 3 rooms, satisfying himself that no one was hiding in the kitchen or bathroom. He wandered about in the darkness, kicking open the cupboards and knocking any books or ornaments to the floor. Before leaving, the owner had made a half-hearted attempt to tidy the apartment, packing away the child's toys in a bedroom wardrobe. The sight of the freshly swept floors and neatly furled curtains unsettled Wilder. He pulled the drawers onto the floor, heaved the mattresses off the bed, and urinated into the bath. His burly figure, trousers open to expose his heavy genitalia, glared at him from the mirrors in the bedroom. He was about to break the glass, but the sight of his penis calmed him, a white club hanging in the darkness. He would have liked to dress it in some way, perhaps with a hair ribbon tied in a floral bow. Now that he was alone, Wilder felt confident of his progress. His hunger was overlaid by his feelings of triumph at having climbed more than halfway up the high-rise. From the windows, the ground below was barely visible, part of a world he had left behind. Somewhere above him, Anthony Royal was strutting about with his white Alsatian, unaware that he would soon be in for a surprise. At dawn, the owner of the apartment reappeared and blundered into the kitchen where Wilder was resting. By now he had relaxed and was sitting comfortably on the floor with his back against the cooker, the remains of a meal scattered around him. He had found a few cans of food, along with 2 bottles of red wine, in their invariable hiding place under the floorboards in the bedroom wardrobe. As he broke open the cans, he played with a battery-operated tape recorder which had been mixed up with the children's toys. He recorded his grunts and belches, playing them back to himself. Wilder was amused by the deft way in which he edited the tape, overlaying one set of belches with a second and a third, a skill that now resided entirely in his scarred fingers with their cracked and blackened nails. The bottles of claret had made him pleasantly drowsy. Smearing the red wine across his broad chest, he gazed up amiably at the startled woman who stumbled into the kitchen and tripped across his legs. As she stared down at him, one hand nervously to her throat, Wilder remembered that she had once been called Charlotte Melville. The name had now detached itself from her, like an athlete's tie-on numeral blown away in a gust of wind. He knew that he had often been in this apartment, and this explained the vague familiarity of the child's toys and the furniture, although the chairs and sofa had been rearranged to conceal various hiding places. Wilder? As if uncertain about the name, Charlotte Melville pronounced it softly. She had been sheltering during the night with her son in the apartment of the statistician 3 floors above, with whom she had become friendly. At the first light, when everything had settled down, she had come back intending to collect the last of her food reserves before abandoning the apartment for good. Swiftly composing herself, she looked down critically at the burly man with the exposed loins lying like a savage among her wine bottles, his chest painted with red stripes. She felt no sense of loss or outrage, but a fatalistic acceptance of the damage he had casually inflicted on her apartment, like the strong odor of his urine in the bathroom. He appeared to be half asleep, and she stepped slowly towards the door. Wilder reached out with one hand and held her ankle. He smiled up at her, blearily. Climbing to his feet, he circled around her, the tape recorder raised in one hand as if he was about to hit her with it. Instead, he switched it on and off, playing for her his selection of belches and grunts, obviously pleased with his demonstration of his unexpected expertise. He steered her slowly around the apartment as she backed from one room to the next, listening to his edited mutterings. The first time he struck her, cuffing her to the bedroom floor, he tried to record her gasp, but the reel had jammed. He freed it carefully, bent down, and slapped her again, only stopping when he had recorded her now deliberate cries to his satisfaction. He enjoyed terrorizing her, taping down her exaggerated but nonetheless frightened gasps. During their clumsy sexual act on the mattress in the child's bedroom, he left the tape recorder switched on beside them on the floor, and played back the sounds of this brief rape, editing together the noise of her tearing clothes and panting anger. Later, bored with the woman and these games with the tape recorder, he hurled the machine into the corner. The sound of himself speaking, however coarsely, introduced a discordant element. He resented speaking to Charlotte, or to anyone else, as if words introduced the wrong set of meanings into everything. After she dressed, they had breakfast together on the balcony, sitting at the table with an incongruous old-world formality. Charlotte ate the scraps of canned meat she found on the kitchen floor. Wilder finished the last of the claret, remarking the red stripes across his chest. The rising sunlight warmed his exposed loins, and he felt like a contented husband sitting with his wife in a villa high on a mountainside. Naively, he wanted to explain to Charlotte his ascent of the apartment building, and shyly pointed to the roof. But she failed to get the point. She fashioned her torn clothes around her strong body. Although her mouth and throat were bruised, she seemed unconcerned, watching Wilder with a passive expression. From the balcony, Wilder could see the roof of the high-rise, little more than a dozen floors above him. The intoxication of living at this height was as palpable as anything produced by the wine bottle in his hand. Already he could see the line of huge birds perched on the balustrades, no doubt waiting for him to arrive and take command. Below, on the 20th floor, a man was cooking over a fire on his balcony, breaking up a coffee table and feeding the legs to a clutch of smoldering sticks on which a soup can was balanced. A police car approached the perimeter entrance. A few residents were leaving for work at this early hour, neatly dressed in suits and raincoats, briefcases in hand. The abandoned cars in the access road prevented the police from reaching the main entrance to the building, and the officers stepped out and spoke to the passing residents. Usually none of them would have replied to an outsider, but now they gathered in a group around the two policemen. Wilder wondered if they were going to give the game away, but although he could not hear them, he was certain that he knew what they were saying. Clearly they were pacifying the policemen, reassuring them that everything was in order, despite the garbage and broken bottles scattered around the building. Deciding to test the defenses of the apartment before he went to sleep, Wilder stepped into the corridor. He stood outside the doorway as the stale air moved past him to the open balcony. He relished the rich smells of the high-rise. Like their garbage, the excrement of the residents higher up the building had a markedly different odor. Returning to the balcony, he watched the police drive away in their car. Of the 20 or so residents who still left for work each morning, 3 had turned back, evidently unsettled by the task of convincing the police that all was well. Without looking up, they scurried back to the entrance lobby. Wilder knew that they would never leave again. The separation of the high-rise from the world around it was now almost complete, and would probably coincide with his own arrival at the summit. Soothed by this image, he sat down on the floor and leaned against Charlotte Melville's shoulder, falling asleep as she stroked the wine-colored stripes on his chest and shoulders. Chapter 14. Final Triumph. At dusk, after he had strengthened the guard, Anthony Royal ordered the candles lit on the dining-room table. Hands in the pockets of his dinner jacket, he stood at the windows of the penthouse apartment on the 40th floor and looked down across the concrete plazas of the development project. All the tenants who had earlier left for their offices had now parked their cars and entered the building. With their safe arrival, Royal felt for the first time that he could relax. Like a captain, eager to set sail, seeing the last of his crew return from shore leave in a foreign port. The evening had begun. Royal sat down in the high-backed oak chair at the head of the dining table. The candlelight flickered over the silver cutlery and gold plate, reflected in the silk facings of his dinner jacket. As usual, he smiled at the theatricality of this contrived setting, like a badly rehearsed and underfinanced television commercial for a high-life product. It had started 3 weeks earlier when he and Pangborn had decided to dress for dinner each evening. Royal had ordered the women to extend the dining-room table to its furthest length so that he could sit with his back to the high windows and the illuminated decks of the nearby buildings. Responding to Royal, the women had brought candles and silverware from secret caches and served an elaborately prepared meal. Their shadows swayed across the ceiling as if they were moving around the dining chamber of a feudal chief. Sitting in his chair at the far end of the long table, Pangborn had been suitably impressed. Of course, as the gynecologist knew well, the charade was meaningless. A single step beyond the circle of candlelight, the garbage sacks were piled 6 deep against the walls. Outside, the corridors and staircases were filled with broken furniture and barricades built from washing machines and freezer cabinets. The elevator shafts were the new garbage chutes. Not one of the 20 elevators in the apartment building now functioned, and the shafts were piled deep with kitchen refuse and dead dogs. A fading semblance of civilized order still survived in the top 3 floors, the last tribal unit in the high-rise. However, the one error that Royal and Pangborn had made was to assume that there would always be some kind of social organization below them which they could exploit and master. They were now moving into a realm of no social organization at all. The clans had broken down into small groups of killers, solitary hunters who built man-traps in empty apartments, or preyed on the unwary in deserted elevator lobbies. Royal looked up from the polished table as one of the women walked into the room, a silver tray in her strong arms. Watching her, he remembered that she was Mrs. Wilder. She wore one of Anne's well-cut trouser suits, and not for the first time Royal thought how easily this intelligent woman had fitted into the upper levels of the high-rise. 2 weeks earlier, when she was found cowering with her sons in an empty apartment on the 19th floor after Wilder had abandoned her, she was totally exhausted, numbed by hunger and indignation. Whether in quest of her husband, or responding to some dim instinct, she had begun to climb the building. The raiding party brought her to the top floor. Pangborn had wanted to throw out this anemic and rambling woman, but Royal overruled him.